So I guess it's fair to say that the pandemic has changed the world. Most of us probably did home office in the last weeks. And at the university, we had no lectures, we had no meetings, we had no travels. So we are living quite a different life at the moment. And of course, we all ask ourselves, I mean, how long will this last? So will this last forever? Will this last for half a year? Will it last for a year? And of course, the next question is IT there to come to the rescue? So many people believe that, well, if you use the tools that we have, like apps, we will be able to handle this situation better. And that's what we're going to try to discuss today. Yeah? So we'll discuss today whether we will be able to control the pandemic better using apps, using digital tools. And yes, if this is possible, then of course, what are the consequences to our privacy, to our lifestyle? And do we have to give up privacy probably for, well, not a big gain? So these are the questions that we want to discuss today in our virtual event. And I'm very happy that we have a huge number of experts around the world to discuss with us those, I think, very important topics. And later on, we will also have a short Q&A session where we discuss those issues in detail. And of course, where I would also welcome all the participants to ask questions. So this event is organized by the Passau Institute of Digital Security, so a newly founded institute at the University of Passau, where we discuss like topics and problems in the context of cybersecurity from an interdisciplinary manner. And this is the inaugural edition of our new PIDS Perspectives series, where we discuss recent problems that also have some kind of societal impact. So my name is Stefan Katzenbeißer, I'm the spokesperson of PIDS, and together with my colleagues, Thomas Riem and Joachim Posega, we will guide you through this day, and Henrich Pöls will take your questions and direct them to the speakers. So we have a full agenda today. We start with a session on regional perspectives, where we want to learn how the different states are actually dealing with the situation. We want to discuss the techniques that are used. So there are like central techniques, there are decentral techniques. We're going to look at pros and cons of them. And we also are interested in the reception of the public. So what does the public say to those approaches? How is the uptake? Will it basically work? Yeah. And then we have two lectures on legal aspects and epidemiological aspects. And afterwards, I would invite all the participants to ask questions and participate in our roundtable discussion. Yeah, with this, I would like to start the agenda, and we now come to the session on regional perspectives. We'll start with the German perspective, and there I would ask my colleague Georg Kahle from TU Munich to, well, give us an overview of what the situation in Germany at the moment is.
So first I unmute myself, then I need a quick time to share the right view. Can you see my slides?
Yes. Yes. Oh,
not yet. No, we're seeing your desktop.
Yeah, desktop, but we don't see slides.
Oh. So, do you see my slides now?
Yeah, now it works. Perfect.
Okay. Now I just have to look at the other screen, and apologies for not looking in the camera. So the German perspective presentation is shared between me and Philipp Kind, so me from informatics department, him from electrical engineering department, and I address a bit the higher layer aspects, and he all the important technical details. Now I get confused. So, because I think the wrong screen is shared. Huh. Now I can flip my pages.
It's good like this.
Do you now see my outline slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So apologies. Too many screens, windows, and Zoom not doing exactly what I want. So I start with kind of how we came to the German solution, then some key information about it, and then I hand over to Philipp Kind. And kind of to start with, when we say this workshop is about proximity tracing, I want to introduce also the other term, contact tracing, and that it's not the same. So in proximity tracing, we have IT solutions where software gathers some signals, for example, Bluetooth, and from that derives proximity information. And this can be linked with index cases of infected people to warn individuals who then hopefully take the right next step. And this is in strict difference to contact tracing, where health authorities use contact data, most importantly telephone numbers, to call people who had contacts with the index case and then are authorized to take decision based on the local disease prevention and control legislation. So it's not anymore the individual who thinks about what is the best to do, but trained professionals with the authority to take decisions. Now, in Germany, there was a big debate. There was a consortium with an enormous number of participants, PEPT, which came up with some kind of solution, which kind of didn't get accepted. There were other activities, TCN Coalition, DP3T, and a lot of noise until Google and Apple said, we now decide what access we give to the low layer functionality if you want to implement a solution in a country. And we give only one application in a country the authority to use our API. And in Germany, this was kind of the government decision to ask SAP and German Telecom to come up with both app backend software and needed hotline support. And it was a kind of a very nice example of how to transparently develop an app, how to make the source code available. And so this is definitely nice. On the cost side, a lot of people were surprised how much money you can burn in so short time. And there is also an interesting relation between the amount of advertisement money and the amount of money for security audits. And we should also be aware, even though the app is open source, this doesn't solve the whole issue of trust, because still a lot of functionality is not subject to rigorous audit. Either parts of the app not being audited, and also installation and update mechanisms not transparent for the user. And of course, if something is smartphone based, you need to trust your operating system supplier anyway, who can nicely update without noticing a lot of functionality like this app supporting API. Now, on the success side, Germany had the most installations of all such apps. In the first week, it was most visible, with 12 million installations after 7 days. Now, the rate slowed down significantly of new installations, and even multiple installations account for a fair amount of those. And some international installations, which are most likely people playing around. So we have, with 8% multiple installations, 3% international, a bit more than 14 million installations. This is a ratio of the inhabitants of 17%. Now, one can have a guess how many of these are actually functioning when a person owning a device is on the street. Some people say 80% is a good guess, which would make it 14% of the population having an active app. And with an equal distribution, you can multiply it to see that about 2% are actual contacts covered by the technology. And then we have to think about, okay, there might be a technical false positive ratio, and meaning maybe you see some contact which is not a contact because the radio signal goes well through some things like a thin wall or a glass window, and there are false negatives because maybe attenuation by human body or other things. And then given that the humans get informed at the end about proximity, whether they do the right thing with this information gives us another ratio. So we can assess what we think about kind of cost benefit analysis, but okay. Then I would like to hand over to Philipp Kind to educate us about important technical aspects.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm giving some background on Bluetooth and how this mechanism underlying the contact tracing works. So basically you have two devices that want to detect their proximity, and what each device does is scanning for incoming beacons. They are so-called scan windows, and they are repeated with a period, PS, the scan interval. And the other device that is nearby advertises beacons. So these red A's stand for an advertising beacon. And once such a beacon overlaps with a scan window, you will see the other device over the air. So you have three parameters to adjust, which is the advertising interval TA, the scan interval TS, and the duration of the scan window DS. And these three parameters determine the performance of this procedure. So how long will it take until see my contact in the workspace? How much energy does this cost? And how reliable will this be? If you do this on a smartphone, you basically have two different alternatives. You can use the Android Bluetooth API, which was available previously through proximity tracing approaches. It gives you three different predefined parameterizations for the scanning and three different parameterizations for the advertising. And you as an app developer can choose between them. And so this is not the Google Apple exposure notification service, but nevertheless, there are quite a few apps on this world that use this interface. Most prominent ones are the Indian one, the French one, and the Singaporean one. The drawback of this, so it gives you more freedom as an app designer. The drawback is that especially Apple will very much constrain Bluetooth access in the background. So if you want to be compatible with Apple devices, you should probably use the alternative, which is the Google Apple Exposure Notification Service. There you don't have any choices, so Google will give you what is the scan interval. It will be in the worst case 5 minutes, and the window will be 4 seconds. And your advertising interval will be in the range of 250 microseconds. So what this means from the performance, I will show you in the next slides. This service you already have on your smartphone, irrespective of you installing actually an app or not. It has already been pushed on your smartphone with, for example, the Google Play services. There is very limited documentation, and it's proprietary, and there's no source code available, so you don't know what's happening inside. This exposure notification service is used by also many apps. It is used by the German app, it's used by the Immuni, the Italian app, or the Japanese app, and many more. So how long do you have to wait in the worst case until you see a contact? Here I show some latency curves for the Android Bluetooth API. So you see different advertising intervals supported by Apple and Google smartphones, and the green curve shows you the latency. So you see if you choose your parameters well, you have something like 100 milliseconds delay. If you choose it not so wisely, you will have a 3 minutes delay. With the Google Apple, you have to expect that your delay will be up to 5 minutes. So, which is, I think, a drawback, because in 5 minutes, a lot of things can happen. There might be brief contacts, and since apps typically classify the risk by duration, by the duration using which two devices have been in contact, the granularity of this duration estimation is also 5 minutes. So it's very, very coarse. Another aspect, the parameterizations are chosen a bit like in this figure. So you have per scan window many overlapping beacons, and they are scattered a bit randomly. So what we checked is, does this work in big crowds when 100 people are trying to trace each other on short distance? And yes, this makes no difference. So this is very, very robust. This is the good thing. So will it drain your smartphone battery? Here you see the reduction of battery life of the different parameterizations that are allowed by the Android Bluetooth scanning API and by the Google Apple exposure notification service for two different radios. So one more energy expensive radio that could be in your smartphone, and one less expensive one. Data for actual smartphones you don't find. But you can see the Google Apple exposure notification service will be way below 1% on all devices. So you won't notice this on your battery. You can safely just run your app, and you won't notice that your battery will drain quicker. How does the distance estimation work? So first of all, when two devices see each other over the wireless interface, over the Bluetooth interface, you know that you're somehow in proximity. But you want to know more. You want to know how close you are. And this works like this. One device sends a packet and says, my transmit power is this, is X. And the other device receives a packet with a lower power Y. And then there's the famous freeze equation, which says the attenuation, so X, Y divided by X, is a function of the distance. And with this, you can somehow estimate the distance. In the Google Apple exposure notification service, it's done like this. So the attenuation A is X minus Y. And each national tracing app can give two thresholds to the Google Apple interface, A1 and A2. And the Google Apple exposure notification service will give you the time two contacts have spent below the threshold A1, the time between those thresholds and the time above those thresholds. And then it's up to the national app to make use of this. In the German app, it's open source, so I had a look, how are they doing this? They make a weighted sum, so there are 3 weights, W1, W2, W3, and they multiply the time that have been spent between the different, or above or below the different thresholds. And from this, they calculate a risk score. And if this risk score is above a certain threshold, then this is considered as a relevant content. So what are the problems of this? I think distance estimation is the most difficult part in this game. What you see here is a measurement of the received signal strength between 2 smartphones and the distance. And the gray curve is fitted what you would expect from the freeze equation I've shown on the previous slide. And what you can see, for example, here the distance is slightly above 2 meters, and then you would expect if you go away further, then the distance should, then the RSSI should become smaller, but it does the opposite. So this is an effect due to multipath propagation. So the signal doesn't just directly travel between those smartphones, but it will be reflected in the environment, and the different components interfere with each other, and you get constructive and destructive interference. And this also depends on the channel, it depends on the environment, on the underground, on the height of smartphones. So it's not very predictable, and it is not noise. So it will stay like this, even if you do many measurements, as long as the distance does not change or the environment, it's not canceled out. So this is a big problem, I would say. Here an example. So I installed some demonstration app from a consortium that develops smartphone apps for proximity tracing. And if you put both smartphones next to each other, you get a good distance estimation, a few centimeters. But as soon as you put your arm in between, the estimated distance goes up to 4.7 meters, because the body really heavily attenuates Bluetooth signals. And there are a lot of other sources of error. For example, it depends on the smartphone. And I think Google and Apple have done quite some effort to do calibration for different smartphone models. It depends on the orientation. So how are these smartphones orientated against each other, and where you wear it on the body. So there are many sources of error. How does this work in practice? So I think everybody was, when those apps have not been deployed, very concerned about this. There is a very recent evaluation. There are some preprints from a group around Douglas Light in Dublin. And they have actually got access to the Google Apple interface from the government, so they can evaluate it. And they put 7 people in a tram, in public transport in Dublin. And the persons had distances of less than and more than 2 meters. And then they checked the rule used by the German app. And here, within 15 minutes, no exposure notification would have been triggered, even though for these contacts that were in less than 2 meters proximity. Then the Italian rule, there were notifications, but the number of false positives and the number of true positives would have been the same. So this is also not what you want. It's more like you could have used a random number generator to get these results. So this is, I think, a bit concerning. How good will this work? I also had a look on what are the statistics, and the statistics are quite brief. So between 6th of July and 13th of July, according to RQI, so the German Institute for Disease Management, they have issued the following statistics. If you are infected, you need to ask for a TAN number, a transaction number, to put your transaction into this app, and there have been 500. How many risk notifications have been triggered by this? This is not possible to answer because it's a decentralized approach. So I think one of the prizes for this privacy preserving approach that has been presumed in Germany is that it's very, very difficult to evaluate what are the true positives, what are the false positives, and how much does it help. I would like to conclude with a short outlook on our own work. So what we have done is we have evaluated the performance of this contact tracing on smartphones. So what latencies, what you get. There we have a preprint. Then the distance estimation heavily depends on the channel information, which is not available on smartphones. And we found a way to get some channel information for many smartphone models. There we also have a preprint. Then there's a preprint from a larger group of people within TUM on proposing some privacy conserving approach. And then there's a QR code approach, which was developed mainly by the group around Professor Kahle. I think the main idea is here that if you visit a place, you just take a picture of a QR code, and then you have noticed that you're here. Okay, that's from my side. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, so
and from my side, I just wanted to show the QR code solution, which is actually not an app, but works in a browser of a smartphone by JavaScript and encrypts with a public key of a health authority, so privacy concerns are also addressed. Okay, and this gives the end of our presentation, and we hand over back control to the session chairs.
Okay, so thanks for this very interesting insight in the German solution. I would say we take questions afterwards, so I would simply continue with the talks, and then I would ask Professor Kwok Lam from NTU Singapore to give us the Asian perspective.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes. Still, I have to go full screen. It's still not full screen.
Is it okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. As I was asked, I will spend the next 15 minutes to talk about the contact tracing approach being used in Singapore. And in Singapore, we use more than just a contact tracing app. We also have a very pervasive system that is called safe entry. That means wherever we go, whether it's restaurants, supermarkets, lecture theater, seminar room, we need to scan a barcode to record our entry to the venue, so that if there's any confirmed COVID-19 case or patients that have entered that venue, then they can contact those people to self-quarantine themselves. So, my name is Kwok Yan. I am Professor of Computer Science at Nanyang Technological University, and I'm also director of a strategic research center for privacy preserving technologies and systems. And in fact, it is also under this privacy preserving technology research center that we have been doing quite extensive amount of work in studying the privacy issues of contact tracing app. So first, the Singapore's digital contact tracing app is called Trace Together. It was launched earlier this year on the 20th of March, and it's the first national deployment of a voluntary Bluetooth-based contact tracing system in the world. So it's Bluetooth-based and it's voluntary. So that means we don't have to install but we are encouraged to install the app. And basically, this app makes use of the Blue Trace, which is a privacy-preserving protocol for logging Bluetooth encounters between participating devices. And records of encounters are encrypted and stored locally on each user's device. So it's in this sense, it's a decentralized approach. So user has to give consent to the authority in order to send the encounter information into the authority systems. But this will only happen when the person is confirmed to have contracted the COVID-19 virus. And then they will give the consent to upload the encounter information to the server so that the server can perform the contact tracing. And as of this month, there are 2.1 million users, about slightly more than 1/3 of the Singapore populations that have installed this contact tracing app. For this contact tracing app, it's a kind of a hybrid approach between centralized and decentralized. That means if in normal situation for a ordinary person, he can voluntarily choose to install the app. And the privacy will not be intruded, and data will be stored or captured and stored locally on the device. So in this case, proximity data collections and contact loggings are all stored at the local device. So contact messages and encounter histories are exchanged and stored in a decentralized peer-to-peer manner. It doesn't require participation of a central server, at least not yet, if the person does not have any COVID-19 problem. And in that sense, it preserves the privacy of the users and information will not be compromised. And as I said, it's a balance between privacy and effectiveness of the contact tracing. So it is combined with a kind of a centralized approach for the contact tracing capabilities. So if user is diagnosed with COVID-19, then the Ministry of Health or the authority will seek the user's consent to upload the data to the server. Then the Ministry of Health will then provide user with an authorization code in order to obtain a valid token to transmit logs. And positive COVID-19 diagnoses are authenticated in order to prevent abuse and fraudulent reports. So in that sense, we have a human in the loop approach for classifying the contacts as well. As I mentioned, the Trace Together app is based on the Blue Trace protocol, which is designed to safeguard user privacy and give users control of the data. So we have limited collection of personally identifiable information. So our Ministry of Health only collects phone number and NRIC number, which is our ID number. It is stored in a secure server and never accessed unless it's needed for contact tracing. So we use a lot of hardware, tamper-resistant hardware to ensure this. And then, so in this case, the third parties cannot use the Blue Trace communications to track users over time. And so in order to achieve that, a device temporary identifier, which rotates every 15 minutes, is used to prevent malicious actors from tracking individuals over time by sniffing for Blue Trace messages. Later, I'll give a bit more details about this temporary ID. And the other characteristics is local storage of encounter history. So in this case, each user's encounter history is encrypted and stored exclusively on their own device. So the authority only have access to this history when an infected person chooses to share it. And the consent can also be revoked. So the user has to have control over their personal data. If the consent is withdrawn, then all personal data stored will be deleted. And all the encounter history will also cease to be linked to users. And you can see because it's a voluntary app, so we cannot force people to install the app on their phone. So we have to, I mean, the government will have to make people aware of all the privacy protection so that people feel confident or comfortable with using the app. Now, as I mentioned, the user, in order to use the Trace Together app, we have to register using their phone number. That's usually for contact purposes, and our ID number. So in Singapore, we have two types of ID number. NRIC is for Singapore citizens, and FIN number, actually it's called Foreigners Identification Number, is for people who have an employment permit or employment pass where they live in Singapore. So basically, it's an identification number issued by the government. And so for devices that is installed with the Trace Together app, let's say we call this the Blue Trace device, it has a lot of encounters with each other by exchanging a temporary IDs over Bluetooth. And so one thing about this temporary ID is, as I mentioned earlier, it's updated or renewed every 15 minutes. And so what the exchange data includes this user ID, created time, expiry time. So this whole exchange encounter information is encrypted using AES. Now, this is one side of it, that is the app. Now, for the app, it's voluntary. That means user can choose not to install, which is okay if you choose to stay at home and you will never have any privacy issue. But if you go to some crowded areas, whether it's restaurants or schools or shopping mall, in Singapore, we still allow this to happen. We are not like a complete lockdown that people cannot go out. So we can still go out, except that there are control measures. One of the control measures is everywhere we have this thing called safe entry check-in system. So in almost every outlet, as I said, whether it's a cinema, restaurants, shopping mall, there's a QR code at the entrance. So they will take your temperatures to make sure there's no fever, and then you have to scan the QR code to log into the premises, so that if there's any need to contact the people who happen to be in the premises with a confirmed COVID-19 patient, then they will be able to use this information. So that is the safe entry check-in systems. And to do this, that it requires a national digital, the national ID card number as well. So it's a kind of a national digital check-in system that locks the ID number and the mobile number of the individual visiting public places. So as I said, if a person chooses to stay at home or in the, let's say in walking in the street, they will not have any privacy issue, because this thing is only required when you enter public areas like those shopping mall and restaurants. And so the temporary ID have a short lifespan of 15 minutes to mitigate replay and relay attacks, and so as to reduce the odds of false positives. To ensure devices have a supply of valid temporary IDs, even when internet connection is unstable, devices usually pull batches of forward-dated temporary IDs from the authorities' backend server each time. And this, I believe, is a kind of idea borrowed from the credit card industry called tokenization. Few years ago, the major credit card organizations or the payment associations, they issued or they published a standard called tokenization, that is to make use of a temporary ID to replace the original ID for mobile transactions. So in that sense, it's a kind of a tokenization approach by issuing a very short-lived temporary IDs for identification purpose. And this temporary ID can be mapped to the long-term ID or the permanent ID only when there's a need to do verification or authorization, or in this case, where it's needed for contact tracing. So the Bluetooth trace device can take on a peripheral or central roles and scan and advertise on configurable cycles. And it's a kind of two-way communication when two devices connect. The central reads the peripheral's encounter message, then writes back its own encounter message. And just now we talked about the encounter message. It is an exchange between two devices, and when it's stored in the user's mobile app, it is stored in encrypted form. And it also does not contain the ID informations of the other party through the use of tokenization. So the peripheral device advertises encounter message as a characteristic value, and the central device then returns the encounter message as a characteristic value as well. So in this case, the central device records the received signal strength indicator as well, so as to determine the distance. So it's not only about the vicinity or who is in the vicinity, but it also try to make use of the signal strength to determine the distance. So trace together does not collect any location data because it's not GPS oriented. So the central and the peripheral devices store each handshake as an entry locally for 25 days before it's being deleted. So just now we talked about the decentralized approach. That is, you can voluntarily decide to install the app. And then when you run the app, it makes use of Bluetooth to exchange encounter message with people near you. And this exchange does not contain location information, does not contain personal details, but it's only a tokenized temporary ID. So, but as I said, if the person is confirmed infected, then it's required to provide by law to provide the trace together data to the authority or the Ministry of Health for contact tracing purposes. Now, so the data flow will be like this. If let's say the person is confirmed to be infected, then the data will be uploaded. So confirmed case of COVID-19, user will upload the encounter history and provide the information to the Ministry of Health to assist in the activity mapping of their movements and interactions. As mentioned, this will be the last 25 days for people that appear in the vicinity of the Bluetooth. And then the authority will decrypt the temporary ID for each encounter in the upload history using the secret key. And the authority will verify that the encounter timestamp for each temporary ID falls within the validity period. And then it filters for context based on the some of the epidemiological parameters like the time of exposure and the distance. So if after all this contact tracing processing, then if it's needed, it will contact people who fall within the infectious time period within certain proximity with the infected person. So the authority will contact the individuals assessed to have a high likelihood of exposure to provide medical guidance and care. So basically, this is how we implement the contact tracing. It's very important, actually, to ordinary people like us. This type of contact tracing is important because usually the government policy is if someone is infected, it's not too bad. The worst is if they cannot trace back where the person contracted the virus from. So, for example, if there's an imported case, then it doesn't cause much alarm. And also, if it's contracted from someone they know, then it's also not so much of an alarm. The worst is when they contract the virus from an unknown source. That means the risk is unidentified. So that is the great cause for concern. So that's why this contact tracing is very important. because basically when there are more cases that cannot identify the source of the virus, then the government will escalate the control measures. Then we may be going back to the lockdown period again. So to conclude, the Trace Together was designed for Singapore's unique circumstances and contact tracing capabilities. And it is developed by our government technology organization, or the GovTech, which has made the Blue Trace protocols freely available online for other public health authorities to improve, adopt, and deploy. And this protocol can be the basis for privacy preserving contact tracing standards globally. So basically with this, as I mentioned, since it's launched in March, now we're about three and a half months. We already have 2.1 million users using this app, which is about 36% of the population. So with this, I end my 15-minute presentations about the Singapore approach to the contact tracing, using a hybrid approach of decentralized when in normal situation and centralized when we need to efficiently trace the contact. Okay, so I end my presentation here. So I'll get back to the group towards the end of the panel. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for this last presentation. Now we're gonna switch to the Swiss perspective. So Matthias Payer from EPFL, it's your, yeah.
Hello everyone, let me try to share and get rid of all the windows and present and do full screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to talk about, on one hand, the Swiss perspective and also a little bit about the DP3T perspective. So DP3T is a proposal for fully decentralized privacy-preserving proximity tracing where there is no trust whatsoever into any central system. And we've tried to give users complete and full control over all of their data at any point in time in the process and making this whole process as voluntary as possible. Switzerland follows a TTIQ strategy, test, trace, isolate, and quarantine. And as you likely all know, there's like a timeline between somebody showing no symptoms but being infected, not showing symptoms and being contagious, and then being symptomatic, where we would like to catch and go back to the time to actually help them and allow us to trace and isolate. At one point in time, a person becomes symptomatic, gets tested, and then isolated. At the same point in time when this person gets isolated, which is easy to implement, we want to go backwards in time and make sure that we can catch anybody that this person may have infected during the pre-symptomatic transmission time while this person was contagious but didn't show any symptoms. This is where tracing comes in, the second T of the TTIQ strategy, and these people will then be asked to quarantine themselves to stop the spread of the virus. So in a nutshell, this is Switzerland's TTIQ strategy, and we are trying to help with the Swiss COVID app to have a digital version of this proximity tracing to allow people to isolate themselves and be notified before they show any symptoms. So to actually catch as many contacts as possible to reduce the spread and the harm that this virus can do. We've worked as part of the DP3T consortium, which started in Switzerland and then grew very quickly to a larger consortium on this decentralized privacy-preserving proximity tracing protocol that was then folded and implemented by Google and Apple as part of their infrastructure. So it was heavily, the Google Apple Exposure API was heavily influenced by the decentralized privacy-preserving proximity tracing protocol that we worked on here. In Switzerland, we see this as a digital complement to manual contact tracing. Let me give you a very quick overview of how this works in a couple of simple steps. When a user installs the app then creates a secret everyday key based on random data. And then based on this local secret key, the app locally creates random identifiers that it broadcasts via Bluetooth. So this gives the user full control over any data that the user broadcasts and completely protects their privacy. The random identifier is then used for a limited amount of time that is being broadcasted. And without the key, no one can link any of the two identifiers. So in the end, publicly, when walking around in proximity, these users broadcast random garbage or so. As you're walking around, the phones register other random identifiers from a nearby app, records them, and stores them for up to 2 weeks. In this example, A is nearby B, and therefore records B's current random number. B is nearby of A and C and records the numbers of A and C is nearby B and therefore records B's numbers in their local repository where they keep track of what kind of random numbers they have seen. Now, if somebody is diagnosed positively, if they consent, like they get from the health authorities a token that allows them to upload their private keys to a central, to a server that allows the distribution of these keys. Now, if the users consent, they can share this data and allow other people to be notified. Now, this is in the control of the individual users that is being identified or has been tested positively on the for COVID-19. The numbers that this user chooses to upload are unrelated to the identity of the user itself. So they are just random numbers. They're unrelated to the contact, to the location history, and unrelated to the contact history or like the people this person saw or interacted with. So you can imagine this as a set of anonymous or pseudo-anonymous data that then allows the other people to locally compute if they have been infected. So this is a list of keys that then everybody downloads from this server. So all phones download these latest COVID-19 positive numbers and locally check against their local database internally if they have been exposed, which maximizes the amount of privacy protection we can give for each individual user. So each phone locally and internally checks without any central interaction whether they have seen any of the keys, whether the exposure has been long enough and close enough, and we'll get to that in a second. And if yes, show a notification to the user to actually warn them that they can contact an app. In Switzerland, the notification looks as follows. The app will display a pop-up about a possible infection. When you click on the infection, it tells you there was a potential infection at a certain amount of time and a number that you can call. The app does not send any data to a central authority. So similar to a user who is positive deciding that they want to share the data, a user who receives a warning that they have been potentially exposed can decide to call the hotline and get additional information about a possible infection. So all of this is completely voluntary and complements manual contact tracing as we go forward. As earlier speaker mentioned, exposure estimation is extremely important. And we've been working for the last 3+ months on different and large set of experiments to estimate distances and proximity based on BLE, Bluetooth Low Energy advertisements. And a lot of this fed into the exposure risk estimation strategy of Switzerland, but we've also been in very close contact with Apple and Google about this whole process and the measurements and the precision and recall figures that we can get. Now, why do we need exposure estimation? Well, notification should only be sent to users that have been exposed to the virus for a prolonged amount of time. In Switzerland, that's 15 minutes. And we have BLE signals, and based on these BLE signals, we need to estimate the given exposure. Now, a key difference that many people neglect is that we do not require to precisely measure distance. We need to estimate the proximity, but we don't need to have the exact distance. Now, the virus does not magically stop transmission if you're 1.55 meters compared to 1.5 meters. So we can tolerate a certain amount of error if we are within bounds, right? So this is a key difference. Let's say the distance is 2 meters. The virus does not stop transmission at 2.2 meters. So we need to represent the current epidemiological parameters, which is very important as part of this work. Our approach is to estimate the probability of being exposed to other users within 1.5 meters, given the attenuation of VLE advertisements of COVID-positive users that have been observed. So we, given a certain attenuation, we calculate the probability of a certain distance. As the literature over the last 30-ish years shows, this is as far back as we went, there's a very strong correlation between attenuation, like how much your signal is dampened between 2 points, and the actual distance. A transmitter, a phone, sends with a certain transmission power Tx. The receiver registers a signal with another power, receives signal strength, and then the transmitter can encode the transmission power in the advertisement, as the Google Apple exposure notification does. And if the keys are available, for COVID-19 positive users, the receiving phone can calculate the attenuation of a certain signal by subtracting the received signal strength from the transmission power, and therefore get a certain attenuation, which correlates with distance. We've ran a large amount of experiments, both in static settings with line of sight and non-line of sight, with up to 15 phones in different scenarios. Here you can try to spot as many phones as possible on the left-hand side, but also in dynamic settings with up to 20 people interacting in very complex social scenarios, where we used help from our visual computing colleagues to precisely track their positions, movements, and distances in mapped 2D grid across the different experiments, which allowed us to correlate distances with people and their distances to measure precision and recall for all of this. In the Swiss app, we are using the Google Apple Exposure Notification API, and we are using 2 thresholds of attenuation. On the left-hand side, I show a quick scatter plot, a heat map of the different aggregated results across a large set of experiments. I show the distance of 1.5 meters and the 2 thresholds that Switzerland currently uses. One caveat here is that up to 53 decibel of attenuation, we get a very good precision, but not perfect recall. Higher up, we get still good precision and low recall. That's why we are breaking this into 2 buckets where we see. One additional note is that we have to calculate this over 15 minutes. The heat map shows each individual signal. So as soon as you aggregate, while there's a probability that there's a couple of beacons from further away that will make it at low attenuation, the chances that several beacons are received over a long distance with very low attenuation are really, really low. Same as if you're in close proximity, the probability that you will have repeated measurements of high attenuation if you're close by is very low. On the lower side, I also showed a figure of precision and recall for 1.5, 2 meters, and 3 meters. And I think the key takeaway message of this figure is that even if you're not in 1.5 meters, so the crossed dotted line, which goes from the center to the lower right, shows that for an attenuation of 55 dB, as an example here, for anything that we miss in 1.5 meters, there's a very high chance that it is in 2 meters or 3 meters distance. So even if we do have false positives in short distances, the chances are that these false positives are within 2 or maximum of 3 meters are really, really high, which means that overall we have good precision according to epidemiological parameters. Let me summarize. The current status in Switzerland is as follows. On the left-hand side, you see an image with the number of confirmed cases, deaths, and hospitalized patients, and the reproductive number estimated based on these different thresholds. At the bottom of the figure, you see when individual events took place, for example, ban of events of a certain amount of people, when the app was launched, and so on. And you can look at this at your leisure. Some quick app statistics. Early April, we started with the first internal alpha version of the app and testing for BLE advertisements and beacons in different environments. End of May, we started a private beta, and in June, we finally released the public app. Today, there's been more than 2 million downloads, 1 million active users, and in the last 7 days, 72 codes were entered into the system. Decentralized proximity tracing provides high privacy guarantees if you follow a fully decentralized protocol where all the data, all the choices of a user are voluntary. The user can choose to install the app. All the computations happen locally on the phone of the user. And we call this a privacy by design product that is the first one that is deployed at such a large scale with collaboration of key players in the mobile industry, backing Apple and Google backing the implementation and enabling this large deployment in such a broad way. It's an important piece in the Swiss strategy to contain the COVID-19 virus. With this, I would like to end my presentation. I remain available for questions both in the chat but also in the Q&A feature, and I'm looking forward to hearing from both my other colleagues and the audience. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Matthias, for the Swiss perspective. I think you gave a very nice overview over a decentralized approach. So now we come to the Belgian perspective. So unfortunately, Jean-Jacques Quiscotter could not make it today, but I'm happy that Bart Preneel from Karl Leuven will give us some insights into the Belgian setup.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to present the Belgian point of view. So Matthias already gave an excellent introduction to DP3T, and so it's not be a surprise that Belgium also took the same approach. The DP3T protocol is supported by Google and Apple, and as you may know, it's now been supported in more than 15 countries plan to deploy it. I think there is already 7 or 8 deployments, and many countries are in test phase. I will give a perspective on the Belgian story. It will not be on technology because I knew Matthias will do an excellent job and I couldn't improve that. I also wanted to avoid repetition. So, and since this workshop is multidimensional, I wanted to give you a bit of perspective on how difficult it can be to get such an app actually deployed. So it's more on the policy perspective. So very early on, I think people were very critical of apps. In Belgium, people are skeptical of government. And there was a questionnaire sent around by University of Antwerp late March. And the indication was that half the people were prepared to install a contact tracing app. But from the remaining half, about 80% were concerned about security and privacy issues. So I think it was very clear from day one that privacy would be very important and that a rather intrusive approach as the one taken in Korea or China or Taiwan would not be acceptable. So then in March, Belgium launched a task force data for Corona. I was not involved in this task force, but it was actually looking at possibilities of how technology could help fighting the pandemic. And one thing they managed to do was collect statistical data from operators. I show you here examples where Google did the same thing, but apparently you can do the same thing by collecting data, cell location data from operators. And of course, at that moment, the government was very careful. They did do aggregation. So if they tried to detect how much the quarantine rules were being followed by the people, but they mandated that you could only get information if there were at least 30 people going from zone A to zone B, and you could not get more data if it was a smaller group. I guess in most countries, also in Belgium, there were many consortia popping up proposing apps, sometimes SMEs, sometimes groups of SMEs, sometimes large corporations. Some of these apps propose self-diagnosis, and several of those were approved by the government. And so if you can spread those and give them to the people. There were also a lot of contact tracing apps, and I know that I should use the term proximity tracing, but for some reason the Belgian lawyers have decided to use contact tracing everywhere, and so I decided in this the terminology in this talk is also contact tracing, where I should use proximity tracing here and there. So many proposals were made, and with a lot of noise in the press. One of them participated to the Dutch hackathon. So in middle of April, the Dutch organized a hackathon. They got hundreds of proposals. They selected a small set of apps to give a presentation in the weekend after, and most of those proposals showed serious flaws. And the Belgian proposal was not different. They actually gave away private developer information together with the zip file of their code. So most of these apps being proposed were not proposed by privacy experts, so they contained Bluetooth data or Bluetooth tricks. So they copied the Singapore ID, but they added also GPS information. They added personal health information, and several used the buzzword AI. So they collect as much information as possible in a central database, and they were going to use AI to find out where infections happened, who was infected, and so on. So there were lots of meetings and calls. It was a very busy time. So I myself just proposed the DP3T solution because Camilla Troncoso, who was leading the DP3T initiative at EPFL, she's an old student of mine, and she asked me for some help, and so I made some modest contribution already in March to the proposal, and I tried to help them. So I proposed DP3T to this task force, and after many long discussions, I think in the end the government was convinced that this was indeed the most promising approach. But in more or less behind the scenes, there were a number of biologists that actually were suggesting another solution that used location information and that used a database with all location information of people. So it would combine both Bluetooth and GPS and context information and AI, and put this all in a big central database for analysis. So this was being lobbied for behind the scenes. And not surprisingly, as a consequence of this, there was a lot of complaints from civil society, like human rights groups and also academics, about the lack of transparency of the overall approach. And definitely, I think that was a mistake. The task force, I think the people did a good job in trying to sort out things and understand what would help and what would not help. But they were not very transparent, so they would not report exactly on what happened. They wouldn't announce clear time schedules. They wouldn't announce decisions they've been making. So more or less, you can see that the Belgian approach was more or less the opposite of the Dutch approach with their open hackathon, which I think in retrospect we know was probably too open and too fast. In Belgium, everything happened behind closed doors, and that created quite some friction and complaints about what was happening. And because of some of this criticism, the parliament decided to have a hearing. It was all on very short notice. So 28th of April, people came and explained what they were doing, what was happening in terms of apps and so on. So, but then, Belgium is unfortunately a complex country. I know that several countries are also federal countries like Germany and Switzerland, but I think Belgium is particularly complex because we divide our country up not only in regions but also in communities, and they're overlapping, partially overlapping, and it's not clear actually where the competence resides. So at the beginning of the crisis, the federal government was taking charge, and this task force for Corona was run by a federal government minister. Maybe also important to understand for Belgium is that we had elections in May 2019, and there was still no government. So there was still kind of a caretaker government in place, and this government has still, I think, 25 seats of 150 in parliament. So they were kind of tolerated in Parliament, but they didn't have a very strong support. They got some special powers to actually quickly take measures in the context of the pandemic, but there was politically a very unstable situation, which is actually still ongoing. And at this moment, the special powers have actually been stopped. So what happened is that the Council of State, so this is the highest court in the country, decided that the federal government was not allowed to organize contact tracing. This was the competence of the communities. This is not the communes, it's the communities, which means Flanders, Wallonia, the Deutschsprachige Gemeinschaft, so we also have a German community, and then Brussels, which is a mix of Flemish-speaking and French-speaking communities. So there were 4 communities in charge, and the only way they can collaborate is a formal collaboration agreement, which has to be improved by all the parliaments, and the average time to complete such an agreement is 2 years. This was clearly not an option in this case, but this was the legal framework set, and so it made every action very difficult, and also made it, of course, very easy to block things or to protest against things. So trying to solve this problem required a lot of pragmatism. So indeed, so we have 8.5 ministers in charge of public health. So why is the half? Because it's what is called Secretary of State, not minister, slightly less powers. But I think unlike in other federal countries, there is no clear hierarchy, and more or less they all have to collaborate and agree. So as soon as it was realized that they should collaborate, it was decided to focus on the manual tracing system and not on the app. And in a very short time, a system was created, an online system with a central database that would be able to do this in a very short time. It was 2.5 weeks. So before that, Belgium only had a manual system, and they had way too few inspectors. I think for the whole of Brussels, more than 1 million people, there were 2. So it was clearly not enough to keep track. So they automated the system and hired contact tracers. In the background, we kept working on the app based on DP3T, as was decided earlier. But of course, these things, both the manual contact tracing and the app needed legal support. And so a royal decree was written, but that got very bad criticism from the Data Protection Authority and also from the Council of State. So the Council of State more or less says, you can't use a royal decree, you have to use a collaboration agreement. And the DPA complained about the fact that there was a database with all the data. I was not involved in the requirements for this database. It was produced under very high time pressure. And something which made some people very upset was that it was proposed to anonymize this data, pseudonymize this data, and to keep it for 30 years for research. So some people found this inappropriate to use the pandemic to collect this data for future research. On the other hand, given the institution that was tasked to do this, Cienzano is like the Robert Koch Institute in Belgium, so it's a federal research institute for health. And of course, their job is to do research. So of course, they want to use this data as well for research. But I think from a legal point of view, it was all a bit of a rush job. And so it was very difficult to decide who was competent and what could be done. And then this also got kind of made more difficult because there was, given this complex process, I think there was also a lot of suspicion in the public that people tried to push something through, some mass surveillance system, and use the pandemic to push this through. I don't think that was the intention, but I do think that there were, especially the first proposal was rather sloppy. So then, so now there is an interfederal committee on tracking and tracing. It depends on those 8.5 ministers. This is like a task force where all the regions are being represented. So what the current task is, mostly they're working on manual tracing efforts. They're working on forms people have to fill in when they come from abroad. And so they also started a working group on the app based on DP3T. And so I had the pleasure to share this working group. So our goal was to prepare the introduction of DP3T in Belgium. So a second attempt was made to produce legal documents that would qualify, and we got another negative advice from the DPA on some privacy aspects, mostly again on the manual contact tracing database, but also on the app, and also negative advice from the Council of State, which says, as I told you before, you need a collaboration agreement. The arguments against the app were very interesting. So the DPA said more or less, you can't prove that this is going to work because nobody has ever done this. And because, well, you say it's privacy friendly, but still there is a risk there. And because you can't prove you're going to work, the risk is disproportionate. That was more or less their argument. It was, you can't prove it's proportional because you can't prove it's going to work. That was, I think, one argument. And then the other argument was based on the fact that it did interact in some sense with manual tracing, because in Belgium, it was decided to build those systems together. I'll show you a bit more details later. We tried to separate them from a point of view of privacy, but we can't afford to run a separate database for manual tracing and one for the app. So we separate them as much as possible, but we don't have separate systems. So to end the legal wranglings, what happened is on 29th of June, this is the last day the government still had special powers. They actually published the royal decree on contact tracing that covers both the app and manual contact tracing. And this is a temporary solution while a collaboration agreement is being agreed between the parliaments, and that should be done by October 2020. And so this royal decree is there for a period of a few months to bridge this thing. And so next Monday, we hope that our DPA will actually give an advice on the royal decree. There is some other interesting aspects on the position of the DPA. So the DPA also insisted that every detail of the system should be specified in the law, because they said otherwise we can't judge whether what it does is proportional. But of course, it becomes very difficult if you have to explain to lawyers what Bluetooth tokens are and broadcast beacons and derived keys and so on. So this has been a struggle as well for the past months to how to explain to lawyers that maybe it's not a good idea to put all the technical details of such a complex system in the law. In particular, not if Google and Apple can change some of these details later on, and you cannot do much about this. So it's kind of a very difficult debate. On the one hand, you want to instill trust in the population and explain that what you want to do is privacy-friendly, a decentralized approach with no big central database. On the other hand, you have then the lawyers who say, well, show us all the details so we can have checked, in fact, that this is privacy-friendly, and show us all the details. And there were some more practical problems because this advice by the DPA has to be given by a knowledge center, and this knowledge center has 3 technical experts and 3 more, I would say, e-government and legal experts. And unfortunately, 2 of the technical experts were involved in either the contact tracing or the app. So there was only 1 technical expert left, which made, of course, the lawyers very suspicious about complex technical systems which they don't fully understand. So I hope that we manage to convince them, and that on next Monday they will give a more positive advice. So something I want to show is how the system works, not the whole system, because Matthias explained that very well, but just what happens if you actually undergo a test. So you have, of course, these keys in your app, your daily keys. So you visit the doctor because you have symptoms, and then the doctor will actually determine at that moment in a conversation with you the date on which you became infectious. And then this will be entered in the app. So for the rest, there is no identification information in the app itself, just like in DPT prescribes this, but this date will be entered. And then the app produces a code R1, which is kind of a commitment on a key in the app. Ideally, these should be the tech keys, but it's very hard to do this because we don't get access to them. And also a commitment on this key T0. So more or less this R1 number binds the app to some data in the healthcare system, but in a pseudonymous way. So this doesn't give you any information on who this is. So in parallel, the patient also gives the national security number, the health insurance number, and the mobile number to the doctor, but this is not processed by the app. This is used for manual tracing, which is also started by the doctor. So then this is entered also in a database, and temporarily this random number and this date of infection actually are stored in this database. Then the test happens in the lab and the result comes back. This is still a very big problem in Belgium to get this result very quickly. I know in some other countries this can be done in 24 hours. In Belgium, I think you now 90% of the tests return only are achieved in 48 hours. So there is still 10% of the tests where it takes more than 2 days to get test results, which of course is a problem for contact tracing. So as soon as the test result is there, this R1 and T0 are removed from the central database of Cienzano. So this central database is used as a starting point for manual contact tracing. So if there is positive tests, the index cases are being called. But so this data is also downloaded in a temporary database that just stores test results indexed by R1 and T0. And so the app will actually poll this database for the test result. So that's something that's happening. Say every 2 hours, the app will check, and so the test result will go to the app. So we did this also because to make the app more useful, but also to speed this up, because you should be aware that getting your doctor on the phone to get a test result, I don't know what your experience is, but in Belgium, my experience is it can take also typically a day or even 2 days before they find the time to call you back. And so here we actually display the test result immediately in the app. At the same time, then the user is asked, he can give permission to upload his keys, as Matthias explained. So this is an additional consent. So even if the app is voluntary, you can later on, when you get a positive test, decide not to participate. But we hope people will participate to upload the keys in the central database. The authorization code for this key is digital signature, and it's generated by this database here on this R1 and T0, and also T3, which is the time at which, or the date on which the test result was shown by the app. And so every so many hours, it's checked whether an uploaded key actually has a corresponding authorization code, and this way you can prevent that people upload unauthorized keys into the database. So all the rest of the protocol works standard DP3T. So more or less, this is a variant of the protocol 3 authorization scheme proposed by DP3T. And there is, of course, again, many fine details, which I will not cover here, but you have to worry about timing attacks. You have to send dummy upload messages and so on. And all these things are described very carefully in the DP3T documentation. So what happened between May and June? Well, about 1 month of political struggle. So for example, what happened in parallel is that the Flemish National Science Foundation, wrote a call for a research proposal related to the pandemic, and a consortium from several universities won a big project to create an app based on location and GPS and Bluetooth data and in the use of AI. And of course, with this money from the Minister of Science, they went to all the other ministries of health and so on and said, you have to implement our system. Which of course we realized they would never get such a system past the DPA. It would not be interoperable at the European level, but still it slowed us down by several weeks to convince the other ministers that they should not wait for a system, but the only development would start in August and would be maybe done somewhere in the winter, and anyway would never pass the approval of the DPA. On the Wallonian side, I think the conflict was more about should we have an app at all, because people at that moment saw the developments in France, where there was criticism on privacy and also very small deployments. But so about a month ago, we finally got the go ahead, and then a call for tender was published. And if you're interested, it's actually public. You have the link here. It was sent to 20 companies and consortia. In fact, they only got 1 week to answer, which was not very much, but then if you can't make a proposal in 1 week, how can you make an app in a very short time? We spent 1 week to review the answers, and on Tuesday, so 2 days ago, we actually selected the companies. We plan to still have a public consultation in which all the documents will be shown to the public, and the public will be able to give input specifically on things shown by the app and done by the app. So there is still some things you can change, of course. So the plan is now to go live within 8 to 9 weeks. Just like in Switzerland, a small company was chosen for app development, an agile company with a lot of experience called DevSite. They work together with a slightly larger company for the backend. But of course, in the last days, there was a lot of criticism in the press that this company has only 5 developers, and how can they do this? Why didn't you go for a large corporation? I guess, why didn't you buy from IBM or SAP? But of course, agility played a big role, and of course, also cost did play a role. And a security reviewer was appointed, was NVISO. So things are, at this moment, pretty hectic. It seems we get things started up, and we hope we can get, using the public consultation, by publishing all documents like the call for tender, the whole description, all the specifications, and just like has been a tradition in Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, Italy, Ireland, a very good tradition to make all the source code available. We hope we can actually get this thing up and running and get the public confidence and get it used. Thank you very much for your attention. I will leave it here.
Okay, thanks, Bart, for this nice overview of the Belgian situation. Now we switch to Austria. So I'm happy that Christian Kudera from SBA Research in Vienna will tell us a bit about the Austrian solution.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Great. So here in Austria, we started very early with the contact tracing app. It was released on March 25th. So I think, as far as I know, Austria was the first European country who had such an app. But the first release were very limited. So it only had the manual handshake and no automated handshake was included. The user was able to view his stored encounters. He could report corona infections. And in the case of illness, he received a notification. And the involved parties were the Austrian Red Cross. So at least at the beginning, the Stop Corona app was not from the Austrian government. It was from a private party. Then the development was done by Accenture, which is a large software development company. And the app was sponsored by one of the largest Austrian insurance companies. And this was a big issue. And at the beginning, when the Red Cross released the information, the news that they will release this app, a lot of people were concerned that the insurance company sponsors this app. And this was also the reason why two colleagues and I started to do some reverse engineering, because the app was closed source at this time. And we were interested in, are there any security issues? Are there any privacy issues? And we were quite surprised. Accenture did a good job. And to summarize it with the words from our CEO, the Stop Corona app fulfills the requirements of data economy and respect for data protection. And the only thing we identified were that there were some statistic messages. For example, if a user had a handshake with somebody else, this information was uploaded to the Red Cross server. So we said, we are not sure if this function is mandatory or should be mandatory, and we recommend to turn it off. Then on the 1st April, Epicenter Works published their analysis. So Epicenter Works is one of the largest privacy NGOs in Austria. And of course, they were asked quite a lot if they recommend the app. And they said, well, not at the moment, but we have 5 recommendations so that we can recommend the app. And the first one was that the app should be open source and not closed source. Then there should be a clear communication about the capabilities. So who should use the app? When can it help to identify infection? Furthermore, the backend should be hosted in Austria and no American tech companies should be involved. The fourth point, or the fourth recommendation, was that there should be a security audit by a security company and the report should be published. And the last point was that there should be already a data protection impact assessment, and this impact assessment should be published. So, as I already mentioned at the beginning, the media already discussed if people should use this app because this insurance company was involved. And then on the 4th April, Wolfgang Sobotka argues for the mandatory app usage. So Wolfgang Sobotka is the presiding officer of the Austrian Parliament. And during an interview, he was asked if he thinks this app should be mandatory. And he answered, yes, if it's evident that we can protect people by making the app mandatory and keeping a record of every contact. And of course, a lot of people complained about that because they were afraid that the government will use their medical data. Most of the people were not aware how an app like this app could work and how many privacy data are collected. And as you can see here on the left, this was quite a large article in the largest boulevard newspaper in Austria. And on the image on the right, you see that over 2,000 people commented this article, which is quite a lot even for this newspaper. And most of them were said they will not use the app. So we had already in the beginning of the app quite a negative image in the public. So on April the 10th, the second version was released, version 1.1. And the big change was that this version now supported the automatic handshake. But the developers were aware that there are a lot of technical issues. And when they released the app, they also said it's not working quite well. And on iOS devices, it's not working at all if the app is running on the background. And since Accenture and the Red Cross were aware that the app suffers under bad reputation, they decided to make it open source. But they said they needed some time to do so because the code is not documented and they wanted to improve the code quality. So in the meantime, they asked some NGOs and non-profit organizations if they are interested to have a look into the source code. So the first organization was Epicenter Works. The second organization was None of Your Business. This is the NGO for Max Schrems. And the third organization was SBR Research, the organization where I'm working. We are a security and privacy non-university research institute. And we decided to collaborate on this research. And it took us 10 days to do the analysis. And after that, we released a report and gave a press conference. For the press conference, we invited 30 journalists. And we got a really good media coverage in Austria, but also in Germany. And regarding the review, we did a technical and legal review. And the important part were that we did not identify critical security vulnerabilities, but we formulated 26 recommendations, 9 of them technical and 17 legal. 16 were fixed in a hotfix. Shortly afterwards, we released this report. 3 were fixed in version 1.2. 4 required a change in the architecture, and 3 legal recommendations were accepted by the Red Cross and they will not be addressed. And there was also a responsible disclosure. As I said, no critical security vulnerabilities. There was one DOS attack. We did not want to report this in this public report, but Accenture and Red Cross were already aware of that and monitored this issue. Regarding the architecture, it's kind of a decentralized architecture, or it was at this moment. And as I said, as far as I know, the app was the first app in Europe. And so Accenture had the problem that there was no best practice recommendation. So they had to decide, or they had to plan their own architecture. But when we released this report, there were already some very good ideas, for example, TP3T. So we recommended to switch to these architectures and to not have a proprietary architecture. And I want to give you a short insight into this proprietary architecture and some of the issues we found. Unfortunately, we do not have the time to discuss all the issues, but here are some of the important ones. So at the first execution, when Alice starts the app the first time on a smartphone, a private key and the public key were generated. Afterwards, a config file from the Red Cross server was downloaded, and the smartphone subscribed to the Google Firebase service. And then the user had to accept a usage agreement. And for us, this was an issue because there were already some metadata when the config file was downloaded and the Firebase service was subscribed. And we said the user should first be asked to accept this usage agreement, and then all the other stuff should happen. Another issue was that this private key was generated only during the first time of the execution. So the key was static. And with a static key, when it's not rotating, it would be theoretically possible that an attacker tracks a user with this key, for example, in the supermarket. How often does Alice go to the supermarket? And another issue was that the key generation did not follow the best practice recommendations for cryptography. So for example, it was an outdated padding scheme. So how did the automatic handshake work? When the smartphones from Bob and Alice met, Bob asked Alice, can you provide me your public key? And the easiest way would be to send directly the key from Alice's smartphone to Bob's smartphone. But with Bluetooth Low Energy, this is not possible because the public key, the size of the public key is too large, and Bluetooth Low Energy only supports messages up to 20 bytes, as far as I know. So the idea from Accenture was to use a third-party service, and they used Peer-to-Peer-Kit, which is a Switzerland company, and they uploaded the key, the public key, together with a token. Then the token was provided from Alice's smartphone to Bob's smartphone. Bob used this token to get the key from this third-party service. And in the end, there was a statistical message that Bob had a successful handshake with somebody else. So for us, this was an issue because this could lead to the de-anonymization of the users. And we said there should be no statistical messages to the Red Cross. Another issue was this peer-to-peer-kit service, this third-party service. Because it was not end-to-end encrypted. So if an attacker manages to steal the keys from peer-to-peer-kit, he would be able to send wrong infection or malicious infection messages. And this is a small fun fact. Although this key is a public key, it's kind of private or kind of a secret, because when you have this public key, you can generate infection messages with it. So after we released our report, the app became open source and was uploaded to GitHub. And as you can see, people already discussing some issues there. So on May the 11th, there was a newspaper article that the app suffers under poor reputation. And only 580 people downloaded the app until this date. And in the time between May 11th and June 28th, a lot of stuff happened, but we have not the time to discuss it. But it took Accenture and Red Cross until June 28th to make an update to a version which uses the Apple Google framework. And as you can see here in the image on the left, this is an image from yesterday. The app is rated with an overall ranking of 3.5. It has improved. In the worst time, it was under 3. But here on the right, you can see an image from an article where the author tried to summarize the mistakes the Red Cross did. And I want to give you this in kind of a conclusion. And the first issue is that only 10% of the Austrian public is using the app. So it was, or not using, has downloaded the app. So 800,000 people downloaded the app, but it's not quite sure how many people are really using this app. Another issue is that the author thinks it was a disadvantage to release the app so early because there was no best practice recommendations, and Accenture and the Red Cross had to do a lot of things on their own. Then the technical problems are solved now due to the switch to the Apple Google framework or Google Apple API, but the negative image is still left. And another big issue was the political discussion if the app should be mandatory. And I showed you one case, but there were 2 or 3 cases during this time period. So to summarize it, in my opinion, in Austria, the app is not working because the reputation of the app is really bad and not a lot of people are using the app. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So now we have seen talks about the situations in various countries. We mainly looked at the technical perspective. So now it's a pleasure for me to hand over to Thomas Riem, and he will chair the interdisciplinary part of this workshop.